Welcome to the SDA Housing Podcast, brought to you by Ndis Property Australia. Before starting this episode, we need to provide a general disclaimer. Information contained in this podcast is general in nature only. It does not take into account the objectives, financial situation, or needs of any particular person. You need to consider your financial situation and needs before making any decisions based on the information in this podcast. And you should consider seeking independent and professional advice for your personal circumstances. All right, let's begin.
Hello everybody, my name is Min and I'm your host from SDA Property Australia, and you listen to the SDA Housing Podcast. Our show expands, highlights, guides and brings awareness about all things SDA in this ever-changing Ndis world. Today we have a repeat speaker, Mr. Brad Fuller. Brad, how are you?
Good, Min. How are you?
Good. Today's topic is SDA Apartments and engaging an SDA Provider. Brad, your thoughts on how different it is in engaging a provider for apartments versus houses? Is it the same or different? And all paperwork and all marketing? Is there much of a difference or is it exactly the same process here for you?
Look, generally it's the same process because what we're concerned about is make sure we engage with the developer or the owner of the apartments early to make sure that the design is correct. And you've heard me before. I keep saying I'm like a broken record. Design, location, and of course, near some infrastructure that participants are going to need, making the house more desirable. Therefore, we want a design and a location that's very desirable for participants in an apartment. So the process is the same. We've certainly been engaged with developers who are building apartments, some where they're keeping, 15 apartments for themselves or 10 apartments. There's some rules around that and density rules in apartment buildings, which we can elaborate on if you want. But the process is pretty much the same. We have an engagement fee and then we look for participants for the next duration of the build, whether it's in a house 7 to 9 months, in an apartment, depending on the size of the building, it can be 2 years or even 3 years. I mean, some apartments are, 300 apartments and at, 35 SDAs would be the maximum because we should probably deal with people may not know about the density rules that surround apartments. So originally the NDIA did talk about a density rule for estates, like 10% of an estate. So 30 lots, only 3 SDA homes. They didn't know how to police that, so they never ever enforced it or made that a strict regulation. But in apartments, they have. So these are the rules for apartments. You can build up to 15 apartments. So I could build one building, 15 apartments, or up to 10, 7, 8. But once...
If it's wholly all SDA, yes.
That's correct. Only that. That's true. So I could build 5, I could build 10, I could build 15. However, if I wanted to have 16 SDA apartments, I would need to build 160 apartments because after that right of use 15, there is a density rule which says only 10% of the building can be SDA. Now, further to that, there's another rule which says for every 10 apartments I have in an apartment building, I need a separate apartment for the OOA, the on-site overnight assistance. Now, that apartment does not need to be accessible like an OOA in a house that needs to be, like with wider doorways so the participant can access every area of the home.
However, good practice says it should be accessible to allow for people with wheelchairs to come into the OOA office to visit and talk to, yes.
True. And once again, we're talking about compliance versus fit for purpose. And so often you've heard me speak about that we can just build the minimum standard of compliance, but what we're always seeking is a higher standard to make a participant's life better in every way we can. And of course, it just seems common sense to me to make the apartment accessible for participants in every way. But there is no compliance. But if you were a developer with participant-led, participant-first thinking, you would certainly make that the OOA accessible. Now, if I built 15 apartments only, I would need 10 apartments per OOA. If I want an 11th apartment, I need a second OOA because it's only up to 10 per OOA in an apartment building. So, if I had a 300 apartment building, the most I could have would be 30 SDA apartments. I would need 3 OOAs in that building to be compliant. Or what it means is I can't get funding for the OOA. So if you were an owner of an apartment in a building if you don't have the OOA, you won't receive, if you look at the calculator, there's a drop-down box that says with OOA or without. You would have to tick without OOA if there wasn't one in the building. Now, of course, that means you miss out on the level of funding for that particular area, which could be, $5,000, $6,000, $7,000, depending on the location. So there are a couple of rules around apartments, but nevertheless, a lot of them are in centralised areas. There's certainly a need. Some participants prefer to sort of drop down the lift and be just like you or me and be straight into where the coffee shops and restaurants, the hospital's just down the road. There's good shopping, lots of flat concrete, easy accessible for wheelchairs. It's certainly a popular choice for participants.
Yep. Now, the 10 plus 1 OOA used to be called, formerly known as the SDA concierge model. Let me read this out. It's a service delivery approach that provides an on-call and ad hoc support to residents of SDA. It involves having support staff available 24/7 to assist people with disabilities, allow them to live in the privacy of their own SDA while having access to tailored support when needed. Hence the reason why there's an OOA office downstairs in a separate apartment with the carer there. This model is designed to help SDA participants live independently by offering personalised assistance without the need for a traditional aged care model. In this model, the focus is on providing care and support services, and it does not typically include tenancy services, as these are often handled separately. So that was the old model. I think it's now called OSR, I think. Do you know the new term? The concierge is the old...
No,
old
concierge is definitely out.
Yeah, out, yeah.
It wasn't a popular choice for participants either, because if you're in that building, sometimes that support working organisation or that SIL may not have suited the kind of care that a participant wanted. And as you know, choice and control, participants should be able to choose their carer. But in the past, sometimes there was a carer already in that building, and if you came to the building, you literally had to use those support workers or that SIL that was in there. However, there are many places where you can bring, you have every right to bring your own independent support workers and not use the SIL that's been allocated to the building. Now, sometimes, unfortunately, you might be prevented from being in that building because of some of the rules or contracts that have been placed into it. So that's something that participants are always wary of, is to check, what are the agreements that the SILs and SDAs have in that building, because there are many that might want to bring their own independent support workers to live in there. And that would be true choice and control, which is the primary mandate of the NDIS.
Yep. Now, we've seen a lot of the 10 and 1 scenarios. Now we're seeing more of the 15 and 20 and 25 amount of apartments in a building. I'm seeing more of it now.
Yeah, so there's some pretty big towers being built around the country.
Sydney and Melbourne, yes.
Sydney, Melbourne, I've heard of 6,000 apartments proposed for Perth, which seems extraordinary, but I'm yet to get that confirmed. But certainly in Sydney, Melbourne, Brisbane, Gold Coast, there are apartment buildings on the table that are tall towers. So, the density rule applies. 10% is the maximum that you can have in a building for NDIS, and you've just got to be conscious of the OOA per 10.
So if we're looking at 20 or 25 or more, where there's going to be at least there'll be more than one OOA apartment in the building. So 15 and 2, 20 and 2, it allows for 2 separate SIL services on site, being 10 and 1 in theory and 10 and 1 as well. But also, as you said, Brad, participants can bring their own supports without relying upon the on-site care. This obviously means choice control, Brad. We've seen this happen with Brendan Wolf's story in the background as well in the past, using independent support workers, right? But there's one caveat here, and that is if you're not using the OOA SIL service on site, the investor does not qualify for the additional OOA SDA income to your investment property.
Correct. That is the compliance rules. However, once again, we would talk fit for purpose, or, we're doing this for participants. So we want to be able to, hopefully, investors would not focus completely on that OOA money. We would want to think that the participant has his choice and control for the support workers that he chooses to have. And whether or not there was an OOA payment or not, we would hope no one would say no to that person coming to the building. However, I understand the commercial consideration.
But that number there, Brad, is only $7 or $8 grand. That's all it is. It's not a big chunk. So instead of being $95,000 as a IL or FA scenario, it's $7-8 grand less than that. That's all it is. So it's a small
investors
amount,
just need to be aware of it. And it just depends on your motivations. If we're all in it to make sure that a participant can lead their best life and provide the best accommodation, certainly apartments are safe, and they have, an environment where most of the time they can live on their own with apartment funding. We do know a lot of participants who would prefer to live on their own. Sometimes they're just not funded to do that.
So that's one factor there that investors should be aware of, Brad. Other factors are they may not want to use the on-site SIL service in the OOA there, and they'll bring their own supports from further out in the suburbs into this larger complex. Their choice, their control. However, on the flip side, that provider, business, and maybe a small business, and may not have the staff and resources to send their staff from their satellite office further out all the way into the city to provide that support to that location as well. So that's also another factor. Distance as well, Brad.
Well, that's the logistics for the SIL business, so just like if anyone out there's got a business, you have to concern yourself with staff, the travel, whether you're in a trucking business or anywhere where there's vehicles and movement of staff around, you've got to be conscious of the costs of doing that. So, look, these factors, I'm sure, play a role in a SIL making decisions about where they take houses.
Yep.
And in apartments, though, there is one good thing about that. If the SIL can be appointed to the building, they don't have that movement. If they can build and have enough participants that they can care for in that building,
yes,
all their staff is in the one place. So in some ways, the logistics of staff travelling, moving from house to house, 20, 30 minutes in the vehicle, don't apply in an apartment building. So for us as an SDA over a building, we're also looking over and sort of managing that process, working with the participants, collaborating with the SILs in agreements to make sure that, again, the participants' world is safe.
Yep.
It's a good environment for them. And part of that's us monitoring what the SILs do in the building. So, an SDA appointed to the building, then a SIL could be appointed to work out of the OOA. But technically, you could have multiple SILs doing that. It's just, it'd be like you've been running, 3 of your competitors out of the same office. It's probably not something that's anyone would be happy about.
Exactly. On a side note, Brad, the word participant-led has been thrown around a lot in the past, in the market, full stop. The exception to that really is when it comes to apartments. And it's because apartment development sites takes acquisitions, DAs, BAs, construction, which takes 3, 4, 5, 6 years, right? So when it comes to houses, participant-led is very much an easier achievement, approach, delivery, because it's such a short window of construction delivery of 6 to 12 months. But when it comes to apartment sites, which are 400, 500, 600 high in the sky, it's 4 or 5 years. So the concept of participant-led doesn't really occur because the objective of the development site was to build 400 units, not to build 15 units for SDA. So the approach for marketing, procurement of participants, SDAs, by the provider is a little bit different, Brad. Wouldn't you agree? Because the housing procurement is different from the apartment procurement in terms of time frames.
Oh, sure. Look, I've got a deep history in apartments, as part of a company in Brisbane where we were marketed in the 2000s, a lot of the high rises in Brisbane. So I'm very aware of the timeframes. And I can remember, even the building Aurora, one of the tallest buildings, 67 levels at the time. I mean, we were talking to the developer in 2001, and the building didn't start till 2003 and didn't finish till 2006. So there's a long time frame for that. So, but still, it's very hard for someone to commit to an apartment if it's a 2-year or 3-year build, as some of these are, and still be there at the end. I mean, some may think that's the perfect location for them, and they might stay. Look, some developers choose not even to release their product till right at the end because of those long-term timeframes. They don't want to disappoint anybody, and maybe they'll wait. And I know there are a few developments out there, and it's really the choice of the developer what strategy they deploy, because in reality, a SIL or a participant that wants to live in that building really is probably going to make their final decision in the last few months of construction. That because you need a move-in date, like everything in our world as an SDA provider, is governed by the date. Our tenancy agreements, there's a date where they move in and start. So in COVID, I know that we've had so many dates shifted, and sometimes it hasn't been the fault of the builder. It's been the COVID implications on materials where we've had delayed finish dates. And look, some of the delays, as a lot of people listening to this podcast would know, it's not 1 month. Sometimes the builder will extend 2 months or 3 months, and then there'll be another extension. And of course, from our point is, if we're controlling the special disability accommodation, we've then got to go to the participant who might have said early, well, we'd love that house and that, but then 1 month, then another 2, then another 3 months delay. So everyone's lately, I know, has been going, will you show me that house finished? Let me know the completion date. And then we'll get all the paperwork done and start initiating our participants to move into that house. So I know in apartments it's the same, and probably more so in an apartment because the time frame is longer. So we do see choices being made in probably the last 4 to 5 months of the build, or even in the last couple of months, because there's so many variables in an apartment. There are hundreds, many more than in a house. And so timeframes can also shift in that. So some developers opt to just release the apartments at the end or within a few months, because we still need a few months to do paperwork with participants, with sills, get everything organised for a move into the building. And look, I've been there when buildings hand over. It's not as simple as a house either. There's thousands of little things in a building that need to be checked and signed off on across a tower.
So you talk about paperwork and process and timeframes. If I gave you 10 SDA apartments today, built, empty, brand new, what is the realistic timeframe that you'll be explaining to the investors as to your paperwork, your engagement, your marketing, your procurement, the transition from where they are, them giving notice to their current landlords, them packing up, moving into the brand new apartment? What's that time frame that you think is reasonable, because it is the vacancy here, a vacancy period for the investor here, for an SDA provider with an apartment just finished? What are your thoughts?
Well, that's a difficult question to try and nail down to a time frame. However, these are some of the restrictions that I can highlight for you. The enrolment process for a house or an apartment is we've had as long as 6 weeks, but it's hovering around this 4 to 6 week period. Now, that's something we can't control in SDA. We need information to send to the NDIA down our portal. We send it, and literally it sits in that black hole for 4 to 6 weeks. I don't know why, and I've tried to explain this to many of our investors. We have no control over that part. It's nearly like it's a giant in tray, and when yours gets to the bottom, it gets pulled out, it gets ticked, it comes back to our portal as approved, and then we have the ability then to invoice the NDIA for a tenant that has moved into that apartment. Now, we can't invoice until we've got that enrolment. Now, there's 4 to 6 weeks right there. It's probably about the same time.
Is this enrolment after settlement? So strata title, council, call a settlement between developer and investors, settlement, and then you come in as the SDA provider to do the enrollments?
Well, what we need is the certification documents. So what's critical for us, and it's critical for an investor or anybody who's the owner of the apartment, we have to supply, if it's in a personal name, there's some different rules. If it's in a personal name, we need a rates notice, because what the NDIA is looking for is to say, if we're going to provide funding, we need to know the address of the house. We need to know who the owner is, so we know that the owner of the property, so a rates notice will determine that, is the person that we'll be paying the money to when the SDA provider invoices. Now, if you're in a company or a trust, we need a little bit more information for that. We'll need, because there'll be a trust or a company name on the land title, so the NDIA just wants to draw a dot between, well, who's the real owner? Who's the person that owns that? So they'll want to see a directors and ASIC search to determine who that is. And if it's in a trust, they'll want to see, they don't want to know what's in the trust, but they'll want to see the front page and the signature page, so they can then tie a dot to, all right, Minley owns that trust, who owns that company, who is the person that owns and is responsible for purchasing this property. So we're happy to, when the SDA provider invoices for that company, we know it's going to a person and we know that person. So we put all that information down our portal and we wait. And it's one of the most frustrating times. And look, right across the board, it's not something that anybody can hurry up, and it's a problem. The NDIA is just slow to process. And I know that every SDA provider out there and is, frustrated over that timeline. However, we can't invoice the NDIA until we get that tick back from the NDIA to enable us to invoice. So even if we move someone in, yes, we could get the RRC component while they're in there, but we can't get you the SDA component because it's not approved or what we call enrolled by the NDIA. So there's a delay. So if you came to me today, I'd have to get that information from you, confirm that you're the owner, put it down our portal, and there's 4 to 6 weeks right there. The other delays would be in our agreements with the SDA providers and the participants themselves. So we have 3 layers of agreements. We would have an agreement with the participant, which is an NDIS style agreement. We also have an agreement with the SDA, obviously, because they're in the house. We would have taken a head lease over the property and sublet to the participants. So we'd also have a third agreement with the participant, which would be, like a general tenancy agreement that you would sign with any tenant in any state. So from an investor's perspective, that takes time. And we're dealing with multiple organisations that might have to sign off on some of these agreements from the participants. In Queensland here, for instance, we might have to deal with government departments, including the public government or the public trustee, to get signed off on behalf of a participant where the public guardian is the guardian. There's no parents or, they don't have the capacity to make decisions for themselves. These sort of influences can slow things down. So in asking for a definitive timeline, it is very, very difficult because that process can happen quickly or it might take a couple of months. But I think if you allowed, if you said, Brad, here's your apartment today, it would probably only take a couple of days to get the information from you to put down the portal. So 4 to 6 weeks there. Whilst that's going on, we would, if we had a participant that was absolutely right there, just waiting for that apartment, then we could begin the agreements with that participant to get everything signed off, which, look, a realistic time frame to make all that happen is probably a month. And that would probably be quick. And then, of course, there's the logistics for the SDA provider or support workers or OTs to arrange the transportation, the standard, the moving of everything, making sure the right equipment. An OT would probably come out and inspect the apartment to see what equipment's needed in there. Do we need a hoist? Do we need to put, a hoist in the ceiling, because there'll be provision for that if it's a HPS apartment. So there is a lot to do from a standing start, which is why, as you know, I like to get engaged 7 to 9 months when the slab's going down in a house, because that's about an easy time frame for us to match personalities. In apartments, though, it's usually one person. So normally it would be a person funded to live in an apartment on their own, and we do like the designs that have 2 bedrooms, because that enables either independent support workers to have a place, but more importantly, friends or family to stay over. A second bathroom. If the second room is ensuited, at least and it's a 2-way in there, so visitors don't have to use the bathroom of the participant. That's a very big dignity issue, which you've heard me talk about before. Same in houses, same in apartment. There are some underlying issues here that is privacy and dignity. So if the apartment designs, we wouldn't take on an apartment, just like we wouldn't take on a house that was in the wrong location, where we considered demand was low, or the design was something a participant wouldn't want to live in. So look, a lot of the guidelines for us are the same. Just a few different logistics in apartments.
Yep. So at the moment, Brad, we have a few buyers who have come to us who are keen on the completed stock we have in Parramatta, Sydney, in the suburb called St Mary's, which have just finished, built and settled, ready for resale. And then also in a month and a half from now, another site in Maryland's in Parramatta as well. So obviously some of our buyers are wanting to talk to a provider like yourself. They are able to talk to you, I assume, while they're assessing their steps moving forwards to lodge EOI do contracts. Is that correct?
Yeah, absolutely. Everyone just needs to be informed of the process. So I know from speaking to hundreds and hundreds of investors, everyone wants to know the process. And I know that everyone wants to chase definitive timelines. But, of course, if it's like a builder saying, we're going to finish your house in 7 months' time on the 5th of November, there's so much weather can get in the way. There's so many things that can get in our way that are not in our control. That's the best way to do it.
I guess it's also often hard to fulfill every single investor in that building if there's 15 or 20 of them, in theory, and then participants are going to choose whichever one they want to choose. And you can't really control that, can you, as a provider? Because they're going to inspect type 1, type 2, type 3 design, and they'll choose what they choose. That's also another challenge as well, if you have a lot of empty apartments on site. And you're going,
Well, it depends on, as I said, on the developer and when they release them. Like if we've been given time, but in apartments, it's very difficult to do inspections. Unlike a house, we could probably get an OT through before the driveways go in. We can't get a wheelchair in until the driveways go in. In an apartment building, until the lifts are working.
Yes.
And of course, there's so many restrictions for work health and safety to get into those apartments in a time frame that's months in advance.
I know, but my point is, if there were 20 apartments with the same floor plan, with the same view and aspect, and investors want their apartment filled up as quickly as possible, it's hard. It's hard because there's so many available to rent on.
Yeah, but you're assuming in that statement that there isn't demand in the area. So if there's plenty of demand, 20 may not be enough.
Sure.
So it's a little bit like, I don't think anybody builds an apartment building, whether it be for a disability for able-bodied people, without doing their homework and understanding that there's demand in that area. Mm-hmm. I mean, we're not going to go and build a 20-story tower out at Kingaroy or Broken Hill, in the back blocks. There's due diligence that you would do, that you would only do that with that in mind. And I believe that those two sites, they're in Parramatta. I mean, I've had a look at them. The Westmead Hospital, it's the largest children's hospital in the Southern Hemisphere there. It is a massive hospital. If you look at it, you can nearly see it from Google Earth, from the space shuttle. If you look down on it, it is, 3 or 4 city blocks. It's a massive complex.
I guess Sydney is a different market compared to the rest of what we're used to.
Sure.
Because the population of Sydney is 5.3 million, and there's been lack of SDA housing being built the last 4 or 5 years in Sydney.
Because of the cost.
Yes, because of the cost, and also the fact that most participants in Sydney, I assume, would be in the legacy homes, group homes, and family homes. So the old argument, they stay in their little area because that's where their family are. It may not be applicable, because if they need to get out of their legacy or group home and they want to be on their own in an apartment 5 suburbs away, they'll choose to go that apartment.
Sure, there are lots of factors which influence choice. I mean, just think of your own family or anybody making a choice to live. Now, remember, I've said before that participants don't have the restrictions that you and I do in terms of a budget. So they can go choose on how desirable the location and design are. But that hospital around that Parramatta region, that's a particularly big hotspot. I know that if we had apartments in that area, there is a high demand in Sydney anyway, but if you could come close to that hospital, which is obviously a great support for participants, it's got every kind of specialist, every piece of equipment that you would ever need for any kind of disability. It services them with a very high global standard. So that area around that hospital, within range of that, is a particularly large hotspot. And I've spoken to SILs there. I've spoken to people on the ground.
Yeah.
And let me tell you, everyone would say, and participants particularly, would probably move out of a house in a distant area in Sydney and come and live in an apartment that was located close to that Westmead Hospital.
Yep. I mean, I speak from personal experience. I've lived in an apartment the last 15 years myself. I don't see myself moving back to the suburbs in a house. No. And that's just me. So everyone has their own lifestyle that they want to live. And here we are giving choice control, because as Minister Bill Shorten said in the NDIS reboot back in December, Brad, what was his words? He said, his words were, if people don't want to live in a group home, they don't have to. They have the right to choose how they live and who they want to live with, which subtly is, you want to live how you live?
Oh, look, sure. For every person who wants to live in an apartment, there's some people that would say, I never want to do that. And people with disability are the same. There's no difference for the way everybody chooses where they want to live. But of course, they have probably more influential factors to consider about servicing their disability. And as you know, being close to a hospital or shopping centres, transports, they are important influences on people. But look, no matter what the data says, even though the data in Sydney shows a lot of people needing housing there, I've spoken to participants and SILs on the ground there, and we believe that if there were apartments available in range of that hospital, what I'd be saying, only 20?
Yeah.
Only 20, me?
Well, I've actually inspected that high rise in Maryland's Parramatta there, next door to the train station, next door to the bus stop, next door to a shopping centre. City views of CBD Sydney, city views of Parramatta City, gorgeous, lovely. So that's a different kind of lifestyle in a high rise than a 10-pack of SDA units in a little block somewhere in middle ring suburbs, obviously. So horses for courses, everyone will choose where they want to live, choose the kind of product they want to live in terms of the dwellings. But the process is still the same, going to be, as an investor, you're going to engage a provider who will then help enroll your property into the portal or the NDIS and procure participants for your investment property, working in collaboration with the SIL provider, given the amenities of this location, and that's it. So the point being is, if you are an investor who is seeking the engagement of an SDA provider, Brad, you're saying right now it's a very similar process in terms of houses versus apartments, but some little subtle changes in terms of the nuances of the product itself, being multiple in one building versus a house, multiple dwellings in a building, is there as well. So any suggestions or feedback from you or advice to our listeners who are considering buying an apartment, particularly in Sydney, CBD or Melbourne, in their approach to the assessment of the product itself, or how to approach an SDA provider, Brad?
Oh, look, you can just give me a call. We can help direct you in the right places, that's for sure. But again, my mantra has always been desirability, location, design, and use the data that I provide that we drill down to make sure that we are only involving ourselves in dwellings that participants want to live in. That's the whole point of my existence is, we want to provide stable, safe environments. Now, whether that's a house or apartment, it's no different. But there is one nuance that's worth mentioning, and I did touch on it last time we talked about the NDIS independent review. And I listened back to that podcast, by the way, and I actually called it the NDIS Royal Commission report, which we've been discussing that previously. So maybe I confused some listeners, but the Royal Commission report's different from the independent review that came out in December. So I do apologise for that. However, it did hint in that independent review that there could be a new scenario where participants are simply funded, not in the categories of apartment or house or villa or, group home, that they might be just allocated funding based on their needs. And they could take that funding and choose whether they lived in a villa on their own or in a house on their own or in an apartment on their own, or choose to live with other people. Some participants are very socialised and do want to have other people in the house to live with them. And just like everybody, some people would love to live on their own. So if they do go forward, and unfortunately, as I've always said, that's been such a vague report and we're still waiting on the government to come out and give some clarity on it. But it would be, I've spoken to some participants on this and they think it would be wonderful if they could take that allocated funding and then go and choose their dwelling. Now, where that impacts on apartments, Min, is previously, if you owned an apartment, you built that apartment or took that apartment on because of the NDIS funding levels were $100,000. And I've spoken on that myth of that higher level of funding at a base price of 123, which people just thought if you built that 2-bedroom apartment, you would automatically get that. That was not correct. And some of the marketers definitely got that wrong. That was really the second room was mainly for something like a dialysis machine, for medical equipment, and you got that higher level funding, rarest of the rare. But it was 100. Now, if you claim the GST, it's about $19,000 is probably your net result on an apartment, because I would think most developers would be claiming the GST back on a tower. So if, let's say, the new benchmark on apartment is $90,000, and look, just quickly on a sideline of that, so I had a call the other day that said, they diluted the funding on apartments. They didn't dilute the funding. It's still $100,000 roughly in most areas for an apartment funding. What they did was introduce a new thing called, did you claim the GST credits? Because the government's come out and thought, well, you can't double dip. You can't claim the GST back, which can be significant in an apartment, and then get that sort of non-GST payment of $100,000 along the way. So it's a little bit tricky, but they didn't actually alter the funding because that's a legislative amount, but they did perhaps do something a little tricky and say, look, we think everyone's double dipping, and they did this. So imagine if you were a participant and you have been funded for $70,000, which would give you choice to live in a house, a 3-bedroom house, anywhere you wanted to choose one. Or the biggest restriction in the past has been a participant, if they weren't funded for $100,000, now $90,000, investor would say no to, say, an improvability person at $27,000. They were taking a commercial view to it, which, as I've said before, there is a balance in that. But now, what would an investor say if you were house funded for $90,000? I came to you as the apartment owner and said, look, I've got someone who would love to live on their own in your apartment. Their funding package is 90. Would you accept them into your home? Now, some participants don't even realise they have the ability to maybe do that. There are some SIL funding issues that need to be worked out through that as well. But wouldn't that be great for participants to have if that was true, and that what I'm interpreting out of that report isn't something vague, that was happening? I have spoken to a couple of participants about that, and they thought that would be true choice and control. And for an apartment purchaser, that might also open up the world that there would be suddenly a lot more people eligible if they were willing to accept maybe $70,000 in that apartment, which would still be a fantastic return commercially. But now you're helping cater to people and give them true choice and control. That would be a great scenario in my mind, that if we could get investors to do that. So as a backup plan for an investor in an apartment, that can happen.
Yep. Yep. Wonderful. Brad, thank you so much for coming into our office today to talk about apartments and engagement of an SDA provider for apartments. As we roll out more and more delivery of product to the market in Sydney and Melbourne this year, we would urge people to just consider their options, be aware of the pros and cons, comparing the houses to apartments, and that people should consider, because the truth be told is 50% of construction of SDA in the market is houses and 50% is apartments.
It'll be very interesting to see what happens when these larger towers start to be finished. There were a lot of apartments made early days, but unfortunately the developers were not well briefed, and they built studio-style tiny apartments, which is a reason a lot of apartments in Sydney are sitting vacant, because the design was not correct. They didn't see it through the eyes of the participant and build the correct thing. But now, given the advice, and I've been involved in a lot of discussions about design before the building's even gone to the draftsman or the engineers, we're now seeing apartments come out that are certainly more equipped, more fit for purpose. So it will be interesting to see, as they finalise, how this choice and control really pans out, if participants will choose that, and whether we can see willing investors to accept them into their homes, even if they don't have the full weight of the $90,000 funding.
Well, as you said, design and desirability is a big important factor, as you claim to be, but there's only so much design or redesign you can do to make a design nice. But my opinion is, as we see the future of apartments around Australia be rolled out, look for the top of the range kind of apartments, the 5-star luxury resort high rises, which has everything in it. They're the ones we are working on in our business here, which are big developers in Melbourne, which really stand out from the rest of the crowd. So there's the old 5-pack, 10-pack apartments in a suburb somewhere of apartments, yes. There's the high rise of 200-300 apartments in a location somewhere in Sydney or Melbourne Metro, yes. Then there's the luxury 5-star resort kind of apartment high rises, which is the bee's knees, the blue chip of all products for SDA. And I think that is where the future is going to be for SDA apartments in the long run, as you see more and more developers outlay more resources and money and vision to deliver a high-end apartment lifestyle product for participants. And that, truth be told, Brad, is what people really want long-term. You know, the desirability of living in that kind of lifestyle right there, where you have rooftop, whatever, and sky decks and pools and gyms, all that kind of stuff on site. That is the future of where you and I both agree will be the future of apartments. And we hope to see more of that being designed, built and delivered to the marketplace in the next 5-10 years as well. Yeah.
Look, I'm getting a lot of calls from developers right on this subject at the moment, where everyone's trying to understand if they build them, will it be a desirable product for participants? And if you think about
you mean if they build it, will they come?
Well, look, I think everybody will come because everybody's looking for a product that they feel great about. and I call it desirability, right? But,
yes.
But you know what? It always comes down to the design and the location. It always comes to that. I mean, if you're looking for an apartment, if you were right in the CBD main street and that's the lifestyle you wanted with the gyms and pools, and I mean, a lot of people in the early days of when we were doing apartments, they calculated that their gym membership and they're going to the movies and having to hire venues out for people with parties or whatever, the sky decks, the gym, all of that combined, they worked out it was sometimes a similar payment. And of course, the loss of transport. You didn't have the transport into the inner city where they often worked. So they're just normal factors that probably influence everybody. And CBDs have always got hospitals there. And usually the biggest ones are surrounded close by in the CBDs. So I'm not 100% sure. I'm a bit like you. I think that for every participant that chooses a house, I think there'll be participants that would still love to live in that vertical city, as we call them.
Yes. Brad, thank you so much for your time. Appreciate it. And I'm looking forward to hearing more of your thoughts as the year rolls out ahead and we see what happens from the Commission with their feedback with the review. Yeah.
The independent review, not the Royal Commission.
Oh, sorry. Yeah, my bad.
I made that mistake as well.
It's not the independent review. It's the review, the Ndis review. Because it's not independent.
Well, it is. They call it...
It's biased.
Well, it's certainly headed with the independent is the word they use in the review. But
thank you so much. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
We hope you enjoyed this episode. Please make sure you are subscribed and following us so you can keep in the loop with all of our upcoming episodes. We would really appreciate it if you could leave us a 5-star rating, a written review, and to share this podcast with those that could benefit. Until next time, catch you on the next episode.